What would you do if everything you owned, everything you built with your own two hands, could not save the one person you loved? For Elias Thorne, this was not a hypothetical question. It was the cold, hard reality that settled over his vast, empty mansion like a shroud. He was a man who measured the world in assets and acquisitions, in concrete poured and contracts signed. His heart, he had long ago decided, was just another possession to be managed, locked away after his wife Martha passed, its contents too fragile and too costly to inspect. Now, his daughter Lily was fading, and all the king's horses and all the king's men, in their starched white lab coats, could not put her back together again. The town of Esperanza sat on the edge of the desert, a place that time seemed to have forgotten. Its name meant hope, a bitter irony that Elias savored with the cynicism of a man who had outgrown such childish notions. Hope was a poor investment with no tangible return. Esperanza was his latest project, a portfolio of dust and decay he planned to transform into a gleaming commercial hub. At the center of it all, like a rotten tooth in a tired mouth, stood the old church of St. Jude. The building slumped, its plaster cracked like dry riverbeds, its bell tower silent for a generation. To Elias, it was an eyesore, a monument to a faith that had failed his wife and was now failing his daughter. It had to go. But there was a problem, a ridiculous, infuriating snag in the legal paperwork. The church and the land it sat upon could not be deconsecrated or sold until a specific artifact was accounted for, the Virgin Mary of the Doves. It was a statue donated by the town's founding family over a century ago, and it had vanished during the Great Flood of 1928. The town's elders spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. They said it was hidden for safekeeping, and that one day it would be returned. Elias had laughed in the face of the town councilman. "A block of wood," he had sneered. "You're holding up a multi-million-dollar development for a piece of missing firewood." The councilman, a weary man named Miguel, had simply shaken his head. "It is not wood, Mr. Thorne. It is the heart of this town." Elias had no time for hearts. He returned to his sterile home, where the only sound was the rhythmic beep of Lily's heart monitor, a fragile metronome counting down the seconds of his failure. Lily was 8 years old, with her mother's eyes and her mother's unshakable faith. Even now, with a fever that baffled specialists flown in from across the country, she clutched a small wooden rosary Martha had given her. "Daddy," she had whispered one evening, her voice thin as a thread. "Mommy said the Blessed Mother looks after lost things. Maybe she can find what's wrong with me." Elias had felt a familiar rage coil in his gut. He had smoothed her hair, his touch clumsy and unpracticed. "Statues don't speak, sweetheart. And they certainly don't find things. Doctors do. We just need better doctors." But the better doctors came and went, shrugging their expensive shoulders, offering words like idiopathic and unresponsive. They left behind them a silence that was heavier than any sound. Desperation began to chip away at the fortress of his pride. He found himself wandering the deserted streets of Esperanza at night, the dry wind whispering accusations he couldn't quite decipher. His walks always led him to the same place, the derelict Church of St. Jude. One night, drawn by a flicker of light from within, he pushed open the heavy, groaning door. Inside, an old woman knelt before the main altar, her back ramrod straight. Her name was Alara, a woman who seemed as old and weathered as the church itself. She was the unofficial caretaker, the last bastion of faith in a place of forgetting. Elias watched from the shadows as she lit a single candle and placed it in the empty niche where the lost statue once stood. The small flame threw dancing shadows against the peeling paint, making the saints in the faded murals look as though they were weeping. He stepped forward, his expensive shoes echoing on the stone floor. "Praying for a miracle?" he asked. The sarcasm in his voice was a shield. Alara did not turn. "I am always praying for a miracle, Mr. Thorne. For this town. For your daughter." The mention of Lily was a knife twist. "Save your prayers," he snapped. "They're a waste of breath. If your God is so powerful, where has he been?" Finally, she turned. Her eyes were not angry, but filled with a deep, sorrowful pity that infuriated him more than any judgment could have. "God is where he has always been," she said softly. It is men who wander away. She looked at the empty niche. The old stories say the Virgin of the Doves was not hidden by human hands. They say when the flood waters rose, she was carried to safety by a flock of doves, who took her to a place only the pure of heart could find. Elias let out a short, sharp laugh. Birds. You think birds carried a wooden statue? They were not ordinary birds, Alara said, her voice steady. They were messengers. The stories say that when the need is greatest, the doves will return to guide the lost back home. Fairy tales, Elias spat, turning to leave. This town is drowning in fairy tales. He walked out into the cold night, but her final words followed him. You mock what you do not understand, Mr. Thorne. Desperation can make a man see things he once refused to believe. He returned home to find the doctor waiting, his face grim. Lily's fever had spiked. Her breathing was shallow. She was slipping away. Elias stood by her bedside, watching the numbers on the monitor, the cold, hard data of his dissolving world. He felt a terrifying emptiness, a void where his money and power used to be. They were worthless. Everything he had built was worthless. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands, defeated. And then he saw them. Through the large picture window of Lily's room, perched on the branch of a skeletal desert tree, were two doves. They were impossibly white against the twilight sky. He stared, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. They were just birds. Pigeons, probably. Common pests. But they did not act like common birds. They sat perfectly still, their heads cocked as if listening, their eyes fixed on his window. On him. The old woman's words echoed in his mind. When the need is greatest. A wild, irrational impulse seized him. It was the desperate gamble of a man with nothing left to lose. He stood up, his movement stiff. He walked out of the room, past the startled nurse, past the useless doctor. He strode out of his grand house and into the cooling desert air. The two doves on the branch cooed softly and took flight. They did not fly away. They circled once above his head, then flew a short distance down the long, private road that led away from his estate, landing on a fence post. They waited. Elias Thorne, the man of logic and reason, the titan of industry, did the most illogical thing he had ever done in his life. He followed them. He walked, his stride long and purposeful at first, then slower as the road turned to dirt and the manicured lawns of his property gave way to the scrub and rock of the Badlands. The doves led him on, a silent, surreal pilgrimage. They would fly ahead, land on a gnarled juniper or a sun-bleached rock, and wait for him to catch up. Hours bled into one another. The moon rose, a sliver of bone in a sea of stars. The landscape became alien and hostile, a maze of canyons and arroyos that whispered of eternity. His fine leather shoes were scuffed and torn. His expensive suit was covered in dust. He was thirsty, exhausted, and completely, utterly lost. He was no longer Elias Thorne, the developer. He was just a man, stripped of everything, following two birds into the heart of nothing. Finally, in a small, circular canyon, walled in by sheer cliffs of red rock, the doves landed on a high ledge and were still. Elias stumbled to the center of the canyon and collapsed. The ground was cold and hard. He lay on his back, staring up at the indifferent stars. This was it, the end of his foolish quest. He had chased a fantasy, a crone's tale, into the desert to die. He thought of Lily, of her small hand in his. He thought of Martha, of the faith he had scorned and buried with her. A single, hot tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. Please, he whispered to the vast, empty sky. It was not a prayer to a God he believed in. It was the primal cry of a wounded animal, a plea aimed at nothing and everything all at once. Please, don't let her suffer. Don't let my little girl suffer. He closed his eyes, and the world fell away. He did not sleep, not truly. He drifted into a place between worlds, a state of consciousness more vivid than any waking moment. He was no longer in the canyon. He was standing in a place of soft, gentle light, though he could see no sun. Before him stood a woman. Her face was etched with a sorrow so profound it seemed to contain all the grief of the world, yet her eyes held a love so infinite it defied comprehension. She wore a simple blue cloak, and the air around her smelled faintly of roses and cedar. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed his intellect and went straight to his soul, who she was. He fell to his knees. The pride that had been his armor for so long shattered into a million pieces. He wept, not just for Lily, but for his wasted years, for his hardened heart, for the love he had locked away. He wept for the man he was supposed to be. The woman did not speak of the statue. She did not speak of the church or the town. She looked at him, and in her gaze, he felt understood. He felt forgiven. A voice, gentle as a mother's touch, filled his mind. It was not her voice, yet it came from her presence. "My son waits for you." The words were simple, yet they landed with the force of a revelation. It was not about a missing artifact. It was about a missing piece of himself. "Heal your heart," the voice whispered, "to heal your child." The light intensified, a warm, loving embrace that promised not an easy life, but a meaningful one. Then it faded. Elias awoke with a gasp. He was on his back in the canyon, just as before, but something had changed. The air was cool and heavy with the smell of rain. A soft, steady drizzle was falling from a sky that had been clear just moments before. The rain washed the dust from his face, mingling with the tears that still flowed freely. He sat up. The exhaustion was gone. The desperation was gone. In their place was a profound, quiet peace he had not felt since he was a child. He looked up at the ledge. The doves were gone. He knew what he had to do. He did not know the way back to town, but he did not need to. He simply stood up and walked, and his feet found the path. The rain fell harder, a cleansing baptism on the parched land. He walked for what felt like an eternity, but his steps were light. The journey out had been a desperate flight. The journey back was a pilgrimage of purpose. He emerged from the Badlands as the sun began to rise, painting the horizon in hues of rose and gold. He must have been a sight, a man in a ruined suit, caked in mud, his hair plastered to his head. But he did not care. He walked through the awakening town of Esperanza. He walked past the grand gates of his own estate, not even glancing toward it. His destination was the church. He pushed open the heavy door. Alara was there, just as before, sweeping the stone floor with a worn-out broom. She looked up as he entered, and her eyes widened. She saw not the arrogant developer, but a broken, humbled man. Elias walked toward her, his footsteps leaving muddy prints on the clean floor. He stopped before her and did something he never thought he would do. He bowed his head. "Will you pray with me?" he asked, his voice raw. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her ancient face. "I have been waiting for you, my son." She led him to the front of the church, to the empty niche at the base of the altar. There, Elias Thorne knelt on the cold stone. He did not pray for his project. He did not pray for the statue. He did not even pray for himself. He folded his hands, closed his eyes, and surrendered. He prayed for his daughter. He prayed for forgiveness. He offered up his broken heart, his pride, his grief, everything. He laid it all at the foot of an empty space. He prayed until he had no words left, until there was only a quiet, trusting silence in his soul. It was in that silence that he heard the frantic footsteps. A young man from the town, one of the day laborers Elias employed, burst into the church, his face pale. "Mr. Thorne, Mr. Thorne." Elias opened his eyes. "It's your daughter," the man gasped, out of breath. "Your housekeeper called. The fever. It's gone." Elias stared at him, his heart frozen in his chest. "She's awake," the man continued, his voice full of awe. "She's sitting up in bed, and she's asking for you." A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over Elias. It was gratitude, pure and overwhelming. He looked at Alara, whose eyes were shining with tears. She simply nodded, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. He ran. He ran from the church, through the streets, his legs pumping, his heart soaring. He burst into his daughter's room to find the doctor standing by her bed, shaking his head in disbelief. Lily was sitting up, her face pale, but her eyes clear and bright. She smiled when she saw him. "Daddy," she said, her voice weak but steady. "I had a dream. A beautiful lady in a blue dress told me you were coming home." Elias crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, sobbing with a joy so profound it was painful. The doctor later confessed he had no medical explanation for the recovery. It was, he said, a 1 in a million spontaneous remission. Elias knew better. He canceled the demolition project the next day. Instead, he announced he would be funding the full restoration of St. Jude's Church. He did not hire an expensive crew from the city. He bought the materials and put out a call for volunteers. To his surprise, the town responded. Men and women, young and old, came with hammers and paintbrushes, with buckets and brooms. They worked side by side, their shared purpose healing old wounds in the community, building bridges where there had been divides. Elias worked alongside them, his hands growing calloused, his fine clothes replaced with simple work pants. He learned the names of the people he had once seen as mere obstacles. He heard their stories. He shared their laughter. He was no longer looking for the lost statue. He had found something far more valuable. He had found his heart. One Saturday, as the restoration was nearing completion, Elias was sweeping near the main altar. Lily, now fully recovered, was polishing the pews nearby, humming a small tune. As he swept, his broom passed over a section of the floor, and he felt one of the heavy wooden planks give slightly under his weight. Curious, he knelt down. He pried at the edge with his fingers. It was loose. With a final pull, the plank came free, revealing a dark, square hole beneath the floor. A hidden compartment. A reverent silence fell over the volunteers who had gathered around. Elias reached into the darkness. His fingers brushed against something wrapped in heavy, oiled cloth. Carefully, with a sense of profound reverence, he lifted it out. He placed the heavy bundle on the floor and slowly, gently, began to unwrap the layers of fabric that had protected it for nearly a century. Inside, nestled in a bed of dried cedar chips that still carried a faint, sweet scent, was the statue. The Virgin Mary of the Doves. It was smaller than the legends had described, carved from a single piece of dark, polished wood. It was not an ostentatious work of art. It was simple, humble, and exquisitely beautiful. The Virgin's face was tilted downward, her expression one of gentle, loving sorrow. On her outstretched hands, instead of a rosary or a child, sat two small, perfectly carved doves. Elias gazed at the face, and it was as if he was looking into the eyes from his vision in the desert. Tears welled in his eyes as he lifted the statue from its resting place. It felt warm to the touch, alive. He turned and walked to the newly restored niche in the wall. With his daughter Lily standing at his side, he gently placed the statue in its rightful home. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. It looked as if it had been made for the space. It belonged. The heart of Esperanza had been returned. The Church of St. Jude became the center of the town once more, its bell ringing out over the desert every Sunday morning. Elias Thorne never built his commercial hub. Instead, he invested in the town, helping to reopen small businesses, repair homes, and build a new community clinic. He was no longer a man of assets and acquisitions. He was a man of faith, a quiet pillar of his community, measuring his wealth not in dollars, but in the smiles of his neighbors and the healthy laughter of his child. Sometimes, in the late afternoon, a pair of white doves would come to nest in the church's bell tower. And Elias would look up and smile, a man who had been led into the wilderness only to find his way home. The story of Elias Thorne reminds us that the greatest miracles often begin not with a shout, but with a whisper of surrender. It teaches us that what we seek in the world is often hidden within our own hearts, waiting for us to become lost enough to find it. If this story of faith and redemption touched your soul, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the quiet power of hope. And please, share this message with someone who might need to be reminded that even in the deepest desert, grace can fall like rain.